Another mistake, Evelyn, and you're finished." Caleb Dorn's voice cut across the dining room sharp as glass. Evelyn Marsh froze mid-step, the bread basket still warm in her hands. She knew she had already delivered bread to table 12 minutes ago. Yet she did not protest. Around her forks, paused eyes flickered up, then darted back down to plates. No one spoke. No one defended her. The silence pressed heavier than the insult itself. Evelyn lowered her head, picked up another basket, and forced her feet to move, swallowing the humiliation like bitter medicine. In the farthest booth, a man in a faded cap watched, expression unreadable. Harlan West lifted his coffee, but his gaze never left Evelyn. Each detail, each injustice he stored away. The room smelled of garlic and baked dough, but what lingered strongest was the stench of fear. It was only the beginning. Evelyn arrived before the sun had lifted the mist, her apron folded neatly under her arm. The dining room was still chairs, stacked air-faint with last night's wine. From a basket she carried, she drew small Bloom's daisies, a sprig of lavender, a rosebud no larger than her thumb. One by one she placed them into narrow glass vases, lining each table with quiet devotion. Her fingers lingered over a petal, and in a whisper meant only for herself she said, "Harold always said, flowers keep the soul in a meal." The moment was fragile, almost holy, until Caleb's shoes struck the tile. He stopped, arms crossed, his voice flat. "Take them away. This isn't your garden." Evelyn's hand trembled as she gathered the vases, blooms brushing against her sleeve like a last comfort. The clink of glass in her basket echoed louder than his words. Kindness crushed under order. From the shadowed booth, Harlan West watched the room take shape. He remembered this place when laughter carried over steaming plates, when the hum of a conversation was as warm as the bread. Now the air felt vacant, hollowed out. He lifted his cup, the coffee biting bitter on his tongue, harsher than the blend he once approved years ago. A server passed by, head-lowered eyes fixed on the floor, as if any glance might draw rebuke. The silence between footsteps stretched thin, unnatural, the very opposite of the family spirit he had promised to build. What had once been his pride now looked like a stranger's enterprise. In that quiet, Harlan felt the ache of betrayal, not of numbers or profit, but of atmosphere. The essence had been drained, leaving only routine. He swallowed again, and the taste was not coffee, it was loss. At midday, the Crowells returned, coats brushed with winter dust. Evelyn met them at the door with a smile that carried years of recognition. She remembered how Arthur liked his tea with no sugar, how Lillian preferred a slice of lemon, not a wedge. When she placed the cups before them, Lillian's eyes softened, her voice catching. "No one else notices these things." Arthur nodded, his smile lined with gratitude. "That's why we come back." The warmth of their words filled the small corner like firelight. Yet before it could settle, Caleb stepped forward, his interruption clipped and cold. "Customers want food, not nostalgia." The words hung heavy, cutting through their gratitude. Evelyn lowered her eyes, but the Crowells exchanged a glance, seeing more than she wished to show. The quiet respect of years was diminished in an instant, silenced by authority that mistook kindness for waste. When the rush ended and the room emptied into silence, Evelyn sat alone in the dim corner where the lights did not quite reach. From her pocket she drew a small worn photograph, edges, curled colors faded to sepia. Harold's face stared back at her, steady as ever, his smile gentle. She touched the paper with fingertips rough from years of trays and dishes, whispering words she had carried like prayer. "I've kept your promise, Harold. Kindness is the last dignity." The whisper quivered, but did not break. A tear slid, catching light before she brushed it away with the back of her hand. She folded the photo, carefully returning it to her pocket as though tucking Harold back into her heart. Then she straightened, tying her apron once more, readying for the dinner shift. Across the room, unseen, Harlan West watched, but he spoke nothing. His silence was heavier than words. The clatter of preparation resumed, and with it the light step of Nora Elling new to the trade, bright with eagerness. She paused near Evelyn, eyes seeking guidance. Evelyn leaned close, voice soft, describing the rhythm of service, how to carry plates steady, how to read a guest's silence as clearly as a request. Nora smiled, eyes shining, and whispered, "You're like a mother here, Mother Evelyn." The words slipped out with natural affection. Caleb's shadow fell across them, his mouth tightening. "This isn't the time for chatter," he snapped, cutting the moment like a knife. Nora lowered her head, lips pressed shut. Evelyn laid a calming hand on the girl's arm, steady as oak. "Then we'll continue." "After hours," she said, gently shielding Nora from the sting. It was a small act, but in that instant Evelyn stood taller than Caleb's authority. Warmth glowed fragile in the cold air. The evening crowd thickened, and a man at table 7 raised his hand with impatient flicks. His voice carried sharp. "This dish is cold. Do you expect me to eat this?" Evelyn's smile did not falter. She bowed slightly, collecting the plate. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll have it replaced right away." She hurried to the kitchen, though the dish had been steaming only minutes before. From his booth, Harlan caught the smirk curling on the man's lips, the satisfaction of cruelty disguised as complaint. Caleb appeared almost instantly, pen in hand, scribbling on his clipboard. "Customer complaint against Evelyn," he muttered loud enough for those nearby. Evelyn returned with a fresh plate, voice steady, though her hands trembled faintly as she set it down. The guest leaned back triumphant as Caleb's note turned lie into record. Harlan's jaw tightened. He saw the trap, clearly kindness written down as failure. A child at table 4 knocked over his glass water, spilling across the cloth and dripping to the floor. Before his mother could even gasp, Evelyn was already there, knees pressing against the cold tile. She gathered the mess with steady hands, her smile calm, her voice soft as she looked at the boy. "It's all right, sweetheart. No harm done." The boy's grin spread wide, gap-toothed innocent, and his mother's eyes shone with quiet gratitude. For a breath, the room softened, humanity flickering back into place. Then Caleb's shadow fell across them. His mouth twisted. "You're not here to coddle customers," he hissed sharp enough for others to hear. Evelyn lowered her eyes, nodding, once hiding the sting beneath silence. She rose, the rag still damp in her hand, and the child's smile faded into uncertainty. What could have been a moment of joy was smothered, pressed flat beneath authority's scowl. From his booth, Harlan opened his notebook, lines of numbers etched into memory. Staff turnover had climbed like smoke in the past quarter. Complaints from patrons multiplied where once they had been rare. The atmosphere, he realized, was more than mismanagement. It was erosion, steady and deliberate. His gaze drifted back to Evelyn, moving between tables with a grace far older than her aching joints. She carried more weight than any of them, shielding younger servers from mistakes, bearing the brunt of Caleb's notes without protest. In her gestures, in her patience, he saw the last fragment of what this place was built on. Evelyn Marsh was not simply another employee. She was the soul that remained when everything else had been stripped away. Harlan's decision hardened. He would stay. He would see this to its end. The time for reports was over. The truth had to be witnessed in full. Night fell heavy, the last diners trickling out. Evelyn moved slowly now, clearing plates, wiping down tables, her hands stiff from pain that no one cared to notice. Still, as a couple lingered at the door, she summoned a smile, wishing them good evening with warmth that cost her more than she let show. Once alone, she turned back to finish the final table. Her fingers faltered, trembling as she stacked the glasses. Caleb stood nearby, arms folded, eyes narrowed to slits. His pen scratched against the clipboard, each stroke a judgment. Too slow, he muttered, not to her, but loud enough that it hung in the air like smoke. Evelyn pressed her lips together and continued silent. From his booth, Harlan felt his jaw tighten, his fist curling against the wood of the table. The night was ending, but the battle within these walls was only beginning. Morning came with the scrape of chairs and the weight of Caleb's clipboard. He pinned a chart to the wall, his voice ringing with forced authority. A list of fines written in bold strokes, each name marked by red ink. Evelyn's column was filled, complaint after complaint, the highest among them all. Her eyes scanned the page briefly, then lowered. Nora's hand lifted halfway, her voice uncertain. "But most customers seem happy with her." Caleb's gaze snapped to her, sharp and merciless. "Defend her, and you'll share the penalty." The room stiffened. Shoes shuffled against tile, but no one spoke. Silence fell like a verdict, heavier than the numbers on the page. Evelyn's lips curved into a faint smile, one that hid more than it revealed. She nodded, as if to accept, her shoulders bearing the weight that others were too frightened to share. The punishment had only just begun. From the corner booth, Harlan watched the paper tremble on the wall. He lifted his phone, recording the chart with its crooked accusations. Numbers did not lie, but these did. He whispered to himself, a thought heavier than the coffee in his hand. There were no complaints. Where did these come from? His eyes narrowed toward Caleb, whose expression remained blank, the mask of a man convinced of control. Evelyn stepped forward, careful, and detached the chart. She folded it, sliding it into her pocket without a word, as though taking the shame into herself. Around her, not a single pair of eyes dared to rise. Harlan's jaw worked silently. The injustice was no longer rumor, it was written, displayed, and absorbed in plain sight. He knew then that evidence had to be gathered piece by piece, not for a report but for a reckoning that was drawing closer each hour. The kitchen roared with the clang of Pan's orders stacking high. One ticket slipped, delayed, left hanging. Caleb's voice cut through the steam. "Who failed this order?" Nora flinched, her lips parted, but Evelyn stepped forward first. "It was me," she said, steady though her heart faltered. Caleb's pen scratched the clipboard, and without pause he declared, "Docked pay." Nora's eyes filled with tears, her protest breaking. It wasn't. Evelyn touched her arm, gently shaking her head. "Don't, child. I'll carry it." The room quieted, the weight of sacrifice clear. Harlan, unseen, heard every word. He saw the way Evelyn shielded the young girl, turning cruelty into a burden she bore alone. Her smile returned, faint but resolute, though her hands trembled from exhaustion. To Caleb, it was another mark on a ledger. To Harlan, it was proof of a soul choosing dignity even when dignity was denied. Arthur Crowell sat at his corner table, pen in hand, the paper before him, lined with careful strokes. His words were simple, yet firm. Evelyn Marsh carried the spirit of the place, her kindness a reason to return. He folded the letter with deliberate care, passing it to Caleb as the evening crowd pressed in. "This should reach the owner," he said, Lillian nodding beside him, eyes bright with certainty. Caleb's smile flickered thin, a veneer stretched too tight. He accepted the envelope, tapped it against his clipboard, and with a quick movement slipped it into his desk drawer. The sound of wood closing was soft, final. Arthur leaned back, satisfied, unaware that the praise had already been buried. Evelyn passed by, unaware too, her arms laden with plates, her face weary but still gentle. The truth that might have lifted her was silenced, hidden under Caleb's calculated indifference. The dinner rush swelled, tables full, voices rising in a storm of orders. Evelyn hurried from kitchen to floor, her limp more pronounced with each turn. Trays balanced on her aching wrists, she pushed through fatigue. At the swinging doors, Caleb appeared, stepping into her path. The tray tilted glasses, shattering water spreading in a glittering pool across the tiles. Gasps rose. Caleb's shout followed, sharp as a blade. "You're a burden, a danger to everyone here." His voice carried loud enough to brand her in front of every patron. Evelyn froze, the sting of humiliation pressing her shoulders down. Across the room, Harlan's eyes narrowed. He had seen the deliberate step, the calculated angle. This was no accident, no clumsy mistake, it was a trap. Around them, the restaurant quieted, the hum of conversation drowned beneath the echo of Caleb's accusation. The cruelty had broken cover. The silence, fractured into whispers, carried between tables. A young mother leaned close to her husband, her voice a hush heavy with pity. That poor woman. The words reached others, and eyes began to follow Evelyn as she knelt, rag in hand, wiping the cold water from the floor. Her hands trembled, but her smile returned, thin and practiced, offered to no one in particular. Caleb stood over her, arms folded, expression carved from stone. His authority hung like smoke, suffocating the room. Evelyn's back curved under the weight of humiliation, yet she pressed on each stroke of the cloth, an act of endurance. From his booth, Harlan's hand tightened around the coffee cup until porcelain threatened to crack. The scene imprinted itself on every witness, a woman bent in service, pressed into the floor while cruelty looked on, unflinching. Compassion flickered in silence, but no voice rose in her defense. Dawn crept pale through the windows as Evelyn entered 30 minutes before her shift. The restaurant was hushed, chairs, still stacked counters waiting. She moved with quiet purpose, brewing coffee that filled the air with a gentle warmth, setting each table with care as though guests might arrive at any moment. From her basket, she drew fresh blossoms, daisies, sprigs of lavender, a single rosebud, and placed them in slender vases, one by one. She paused, touching the petals, whispering, "Harold would have liked this." Her words were soft, but they anchored her resolve against the silence. Across the room, unnoticed, Harlan watched from his booth, his eyes tracing each gesture. This act, simple yet defiant, lit a spark within the gloom. It was more than decoration. It was resistance, the insistence that kindness still belonged here. And, though the morning was still, he felt the pulse of change stirring quietly. The door banged open, shattering the fragile calm. Caleb strode in, his eyes sweeping across the room until they caught the vases. His voice cracked like a whip. "What is this? Do you think this is your garden?" Evelyn straightened, her voice steady, though her hands betrayed her. "The flowers are from my yard. They cost nothing, and guests appreciate them." For a moment, the blooms seemed to soften the edges of the room. Then Caleb's hand shot out, seizing a vase. Glass clattered as he hurled it into the bin petals crushed against metal. Evelyn flinched, her fingers stiffening at her sides. Her face remained composed, but her hand trembled against her apron. The destruction echoed louder than any insult, a deliberate strike at her quiet offering. Caleb's glare lingered, daring anyone to object. None did. The act was more than anger. It was the stamping out of hope. Through the tension, Harlan's eyes moved across the staff. He caught the furtive glances of younger servers, their gazes slipping toward Evelyn before darting away. Fear kept their voices hushed, yet reliance shone clear. They leaned on her presence like scaffolding in a collapsing structure. Evelyn, sensing their unease, reached to straighten Nora's collar, adjusting the wrinkle with a gentle smile. The girl's shoulders eased, but the relief was short-lived. From across the room, Caleb's stare cut sharp, a silent warning. The weight pressed down until the air itself felt strained, drawn tight as a string on the verge of snapping. Evelyn's quiet steadiness stood against it, but even steadiness carried cracks. Harlan sat back, seeing clearly this woman was the anchor holding the fragile crew together. And in that truth lay a darker one. The entire balance of the restaurant rested on a thread pulled taut by cruelty. The kitchen roared with noise, steam clouding the air as voices clashed with clanging pans. A pot of soup slipped crashing to the floor, scalding liquid spreading in a steaming flood. Caleb barked from the doorway, his voice harsh, but he never moved closer. Staff froze, too afraid to act. It was Evelyn who stepped forward, grabbing Towel's knees, pressing into the slippery tiles as she mopped the spill. Her breath was heavy, arms straining, yet she worked without pause. Then Nora rushed in, trying to help, her shoes catching the wet patch. She fell hard, a cry tearing through the air. Before anyone else reacted, Evelyn was already there, her hands cradling the girl, shielding her from the heat and the chaos. Her arms became a shelter, her voice soft against the panic. Around them, the kitchen held still, cruelty shouting from a distance while compassion bled quietly on the floor. Caleb's stride thundered across the kitchen, his face read words cutting like fire. "Useless, both of you." His glare swept from Evelyn, still crouched beside Nora, to the girl clutching her hip. Nora's tears spilled, her voice breaking. It wasn't her fault. Evelyn placed a hand on her arm, whispering, "Hush, child. I'll take it." She looked up, her own voice quiet, steady as stone under the storm. "The blame is mine." Caleb's pen scratched the clipboard, his sneer curling. "Then it's cause for termination." The words dripped with satisfaction, sealing cruelty into record. The staff looked on, eyes wide, but lips sealed, too frightened to speak. Nora shook her head violently, sobbing. Evelyn only held her closer, absorbing the weight. In that moment, Harlan's breath caught. He saw not resignation, but a choice, Evelyn taking punishment to spare another. It was dignity turned into armor, even as it was used against her. Harlan stepped back from the heat of the kitchen chest, tight, the scene replaying in his mind. His hand trembled as he pulled out his phone, calling his assistant. "Cancel the meetings," he ordered, voice rough. "I won't be leaving. Not yet." Closing the line, he opened his notebook, the pages already crowded with notes. He wrote in heavy strokes, Caleb rotting the system from within. His pen pressed hard enough to tear the paper. He lifted his gaze, finding Evelyn across the kitchen, still kneeling beside Nora, whispering comfort despite the cruelty hanging over her head. His eyes stung moisture, threatening to blur his view. He clenched his jaw, letting the silence between them carry the weight of decision. Inwardly, he whispered, steady, certain, tomorrow will be different. It was no longer observation. It was preparation. The storm had gathered, and the reckoning was beginning to take form. From the half-open office door, Caleb's voice carried low but sharp. "Yes. Friday. I'll cut that old liability. No risk of appeal, I've documented everything. She won't be our problem after this." His words were smooth, practiced, spoken without hesitation. Harlan had been walking past, but he stopped, every syllable cutting into him like a blade. His hand curled tight, knuckles whitening. The fury in his chest was not just for Evelyn, but for the decay infecting his creation. He plans to erase her. Harlan thought, his jaw tightening. "Erase the soul of what I built." In that instant, the last trace of detachment vanished. This was no longer observation, it was war. The cruelty was not simply personal, it was a strategy, deliberate and merciless. Harlan stepped back into the hall, his face darkened, each step heavier. The time for silence was closing, and he knew the moment was near. Late that night, the restaurant hushed again. Evelyn remained moving quietly from table to table. She straightened cutlery-smoothed creases in cloth, set one last bloom from her garden into a vase. Her hands lingered as if imprinting memory onto each detail. She whispered to herself, "The last time." The words slipped into the empty air, fragile as breath. In the shadows, Harlan stepped forward, drawn to speak, to break his cover and ease her burden. Yet he stopped, the words caught in his throat. He watched her back straight, yet trembling, and felt the swell of something pressing against restraint. He knew the storm had not yet broken. To reveal himself too soon would rob the truth of its weight. So he stood there silent, his fists clenched at his sides, carrying all the anger and sorrow she never saw. Waiting, gathering, holding it for what was to come. The following day, Caleb's announcement rang through the dining room, his voice sharp and triumphant. "This afternoon, we will be saying farewell to Evelyn." The words landed like stones, heavy and unyielding. Around him, staff kept their eyes, low lips sealed by fear. Not one dared to speak, though unease rippled beneath their silence. Evelyn stood still, her face-pale eyes glistening but dry. She lowered her head and gave a small nod as though to accept the execution with quiet dignity. The moment stretched, suffocating. Then from the far corner a chair scraped against the floor. Harlan rose his frame, steady, his expression carved in iron. He stepped forward, his voice cutting across the silence with finality. Enough. The room froze. Every gaze turned toward the man they had barely noticed. In his stance and his tone there was no disguise. The confrontation had finally begun. Harlan's voice cut through the silence, measured but sharp. Why was she disciplined? Caleb straightened his smirk thin. Customer complaints? Repeated, documented. His certainty hung in the air until Arthur Crowell rose from his seat. His cane tapped the floor once firm. That is a lie. The room shifted. Lillian stood beside him, her voice clear though lined with years. She is the reason we return year after year. Evelyn remembers details no one else cares to notice. That is not incompetence, it is devotion. A hush spread across the staff, whispers moving like wind through dry leaves. Faces turned toward Evelyn, their silence now threaded with quiet agreement. Caleb's mask faltered for the first time, his jaw stiffening as doubt rippled through the dining room. The first crack had opened, and in that moment Harlan saw it, the beginning of the tide, turning one voice rising where silence had reigned. Caleb's laugh was forced brittle. One or two customers hardly prove anything. Anecdotes do not outweigh data. He tried to sound steady, but his eyes darted. Harlan's hand moved to the desk, pulling open the drawer with deliberate force. From inside he withdrew an envelope, the handwriting still neat, the fold unbroken. He unfolded it and read aloud each word, landing heavy. Evelyn Marsh is the heart of this place. Her kindness makes strangers into family. The room fell utterly still. Not a sound from Forks, not a whisper among the staff. Only the truth echoing back against Caleb's false reports. A bead of sweat slid down Caleb's temple, his smirk collapsing into silence. Around the room, eyes shifted, some toward Evelyn, some toward Caleb, but all knew what had been hidden. The letter had not vanished. It had been buried, and now it stood against him as undeniable proof. Caleb's stammered words tangled on his tongue. I hadn't had the chance to deliver it. Harlan's stare was unyielding, his question carved like stone. Or did you intend to bury it? Murmurs broke among the staff, low but growing, their eyes flicking to Evelyn, then back to the manager who had ruled them with fear. Evelyn sat frozen, her hands gripping her apron, disbelief etching her face. She had never expected defense, much less vindication, written in another's hand. Arthur raised his chin, his voice steady. He speaks the truth. That letter was meant for the owner. The confirmation spread like fire, sparking certainty where hesitation had lingered. Caleb's pretense cracked wide, the weight of exposure pressing down. What had once been record against Evelyn now revealed itself as fabrication fragile as ash. And in the collapse of his lies, the room began to breathe differently, fuller, stronger. The silence broke with the scrape of wood as Harlan rose. His hand lifted slowly, removing the worn cap that had shadowed his face. His eyes, cold and unflinching, cut through the room. I am Harlan West, the owner of this restaurant. The words struck like iron against stone. Conversation died instantly. The air itself seemed to contract. Caleb's color drained his lips parting, but no sound forming. At the center of the room, Evelyn froze the vase she carried, slipping from her grip. It shattered on the floor petals, scattered among shards, the sound sharp as a gunshot. Her breath caught her eyes wide with disbelief. Every gaze turned now to Harlan, the quiet man revealed as master of the house. In that revelation lay judgment raw and undeniable. The mask had fallen, and the reckoning that Caleb thought he controlled was no longer his to command. Caleb forced a thin smile, words tumbling too quickly. "Sir, everything I've done was for the restaurant's reputation." The attempt broke under Harlan's roar. "Reputation. You call it reputation to break the soul of this place?" His voice cracked the silence, echoing off the walls. Chairs scraped as staff rose one by one, their eyes lit not with fear, but defiance. A ripple moved through them, strength gathering in their stance. Across the room, a few customers began to clap, hesitant at first, then firmer rhythm building against Caleb's authority. Evelyn, unable to contain herself, covered her face and wept, her shoulders shaking. The moment hung suspended power, shifting in plain sight. Caleb's composure frayed his eyes, darting from the staff to the owner whose judgment he could not escape. For the first time, his control faltered. The collective had found its voice, and it was not his. Harlan's voice carried again, steady, now sharpened by conviction. "I have watched for 3 days. I have seen everything." His words struck like hammer blows, each one driving deeper. "I saw you block her path, forcing her to spill a tray. I saw you bury a letter written in praise. I saw you punish her for mistakes that were not hers, pushing blame onto Nora while she carried the weight." Caleb's lips opened, but no defense came. Sweat gathered at his brow, sliding down his temple in slow rivulets. The silence of the dining room thickened, every ear straining to absorb each accusation. There was nowhere to turn, nowhere to hide. The lies had been pulled into the open, their paper-thin strength collapsing. Caleb's chest heaved, but no words emerged. The evidence hung heavy, undeniable, and the crowd's silence transformed into judgment more cutting than any outburst. Harlan's command rang through the dining room, final and absolute. "Caleb Dorn, you are terminated. Effective immediately." The words cut through the air with the weight of judgment. Every member of staff froze, breath held as though waiting for a thunderclap. Caleb's eyes widened, his face contorting, but the authority in Harlan's voice allowed no protest. 2 security men stepped forward, their presence silent yet decisive. Caleb thrashed against the inevitability, shouting, "You'll regret this. All of you will regret this." His voice cracked with desperation, echoing against walls that no longer belonged to him. The crowd watched in silence, no sympathy rising, only relief. Then the door shut behind him with a heavy slam, final and resonant. The sound was not merely wood meeting frame, it was the collapse of his reign. In the echo, tension broke like glass, and the balance of power shifted forever in plain sight. For a breath, silence lingered, stunned and fragile. Then, from the back of the room, Nora's small hands came together in applause. The sound was hesitant, almost trembling, but it carried. Another joined then another, until the rhythm swelled into thunder, rolling across the dining room. Customers stood clapping in unison, their faces alight with relief and pride. The staff followed, some with tears in their eyes, their palms striking together with release they had long been denied. Evelyn sank into the nearest chair, overcome, her hands covering her face as sobs broke free at last. Years of endurance spilled into that moment, no longer hidden. The applause grew louder, filling every corner, not for Harlan, but for her. Harlan moved slowly toward her, the weight of the scene pressing upon him. Each step carried the gravity of recognition. The people had chosen their heart, and it was Evelyn Marsh. The applause softened into quiet, the kind that waits for something sacred. Harlan came closer, then bent to one knee before Evelyn. His voice carried not command now, but reverence. "Age is not a burden. Kindness is not a flaw." The words struck deeper than reprimand ever could. Evelyn lifted her face streaked with tears, her chest shaking with sobs she could no longer contain. The dam of composure broke, and her weeping filled the silence. Around her, staff wiped their eyes, tears slipping freely, their grief and admiration mingling as one. Even the customers, moments ago clapping, now stood hushed, bearing witness. It was no longer about business or policies or profit margins. It was about dignity restored before those who had seen it torn down. In that kneeling posture, Harlan gave back what Caleb had tried to steal, the truth that Evelyn's worth was beyond measure. Harlan's voice softened, yet carried weight that no one in the room could ignore. "This place needs a manager," he said, "and you are the only choice." Evelyn's head lifted sharply, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I've never managed anything," she whispered, shaking her head as if the idea itself were too heavy. Harlan leaned closer, his gaze steady. "You've been managing hearts for years. You've guided them, protected them, kept this place alive when everything else was crumbling." For a long breath, silence lingered until a cheer broke from the staff, then another until the room filled with shouts of joy. Evelyn's hand covered her mouth, tears streaming as she nodded, unable to speak. At last, her voice broke free. "If you believe in me, I'll do it." Applause surged again, fierce and jubilant. The twist was not punishment, it was recognition. At last, justice turned to triumph. 6 months later, the restaurant breathed again. The air was no longer heavy with silence, but lifted by laughter, by conversation spilling from table to table. Every surface bore small vases of fresh flowers, their colors bright against the wood. They had become a tradition not forbidden, but celebrated. At the center, Evelyn moved with quiet command, her posture straight, her voice calm as she guided the younger staff. She corrected with patience, praised with warmth, and carried herself with a dignity born not of title, but of resilience. The staff mirrored her, their faces open, their movements light. And in his corner booth, Harlan sat as he had before, coffee in hand, watching. But his eyes no longer narrowed with suspicion, they softened with pride. The restaurant was not merely alive again. It had been reborn, carrying in its pulse the values he once feared had been lost forever. Nora approached Harlan one afternoon, her steps quick, her eyes alight. "Mr. West," she said, breathless, "I'm going to college. Evelyn helped me fill out the scholarship forms. I never thought I'd have the chance." Harlan's heart stirred memories of a long-neglected fund rising in his mind. The scholarship he had once started had been revived not by him, but by Evelyn's steady hand. His chest tightened with gratitude, with the recognition that she had not only saved the restaurant but restored its purpose. Across the room, Evelyn spoke gently to a young server, urging her to keep dreaming beyond the walls of the dining room. Hope lingered in the air, stronger than any aroma from the kitchen. Harlan nodded slowly, his smile faint but sure. Evelyn had done more than heal the wounds Caleb left. She had planted seeds of futures, and one by one they had begun to grow. One afternoon, the door opened and a figure entered quietly. Caleb. The authority he once carried was gone. His shoulders bent, his steps slow. The staff noticed first, their eyes following as whispers rippled through the room. He stopped before Evelyn, his gaze lowered, then lifted with trembling honesty. "I came to apologize," he said, his voice unsteady. The weight of the admission pressed into the silence. Employees stilled at their stations, customers paused mid-bite, all eyes fixed on the woman he had broken, now standing taller than him in calm strength. Evelyn did not speak at once. She simply looked at him, her face unreadable, listening in silence. The power in the room shifted again, not through rage or triumph, but through the fragile act of humility. Caleb's return was not a demand, it was a plea, and everyone present waited for her response. Caleb's voice cracked bare of defense. "I cannot forgive myself. Not for what I did to you." His words faltered, heavy with shame. Evelyn's hand moved to her apron pocket, withdrawing a small yellow flower. She held it gently, then placed it into his hand. "Forgiveness," she said softly, "is planting a new seed after pulling the weeds." The words fell like water into parched soil. Caleb's eyes brimmed, he bowed his head, unable to speak, his body trembling with relief and grief intertwined. Around them, the room hushed. Staff and customers alike bore witness in reverent silence, the kind reserved for moments that cut deeper than punishment. In that instant, Evelyn's act lifted the weight no reprimand could match. Her forgiveness did not erase his guilt, it offered him the chance to change, and the restaurant, once fractured, stood whole in the stillness of her grace. Evelyn turned to Harlan, her eyes bright, though still rimmed with tears. "Kindness is never wasted," she said quietly. "It always finds a way to bloom." The words lingered, carrying more weight than any speech could. In imagination, flowers spread across the tables, blossoms opening where bitterness once lived. Harlan inclined his head, his voice firm, yet warm. "And today, it has bloomed." Silence followed, full, resonant, alive. Then a gentle call to those listening. "If you have ever chosen kindness despite injustice, right, I have too." The story closed, leaving not an end but an echo.